Welcome to Parsha in Halacha and Hashkafa. As each week we look at a pasuk or two in the Parsha and understand it through the Mefarshei Mikras, the commentators in the Chumash, as well as the Rabbinic literature, and of course Halacha and Hashkafa as well. This week we're going to be looking at the concept of vegetarianism. In fact, they say the joke that vegetarian is the Hindu word for bad hunter. However, what's interesting is that how we're supposed to approach this concept from a halachic perspective. What is the real Jewish approach when it comes to those that eat meat? Is it something that should be discouraged or something should be encouraged? How exactly should we look at it? In fact, we know that humans, unfortunately, have been involved in killing not just animals for their consumption, but actually even bringing animals to extinction. In fact, there's a true story in the Bronx Zoo. At some point in history, they had in the Bronx Zoo an enclosure. And they had outside a sign by saying this is the most dangerous animal, an animal that has brought extinction to so many other animals, especially in the last century. And as you walked into this little enclosure, you walked in and all you saw was a mirror, because we know humans, of course, have been involved in the killing of many different animals to be able to survive and to thrive, as well as obviously for consumption purposes. And the question, of course, is what should be the Jewish approach to this idea? So we start off with a pasuk. You can see here a pasuk in the end of the account of creation. It says, "Vayomer Elokim," Hashem says here again, speaking to Adam and Chava, "Hine nasat lachem, behold, I've given to you." It's called Esev Zerah, all herbage, all that bears seed. It's on the face of the land. That's collates all the trees. That has fruit of the trees. Again, the ability to bear seed, to bear fruit. Lochem yelachla, to you, it will be given for consumption purposes. However, this verse is brought contextually within the concept not just of Adam and Chava, but also to animals as well. And it's with this idea, Rashi brings a comparison between not just what humans eat, but also what animals eat. In fact, they were given originally the same diet. And the Aryeh, the commentators on Rashi, such as the Maharal and others, explain that just like animals were unable to kill humans, so too humans were unable to kill animals. To see it inside the words of Rashi, Rashi says, that there was a comparison brought between animals, domesticated animals, wild animals, for their consumption of food together with mankind. And it was not actually given permission for Adam and his wife Chava to be able to kill a living creature and to eat from its flesh. It's a whole discussion whether or not they could have what's called roadkill or something that died naturally, but nonetheless, they were not for sure allowed to be able to kill an animal for consumption purposes. Rather, we're told that all herbage they would eat together like the rest of the animal kingdom. However, we know that changed. We know also that changed some 10 generations later, or in the following parsha, in Parshas Noach, as the Torah continues to explain, Shavo, Bnei Noach, Hitzel and Basar, that we know that the time of Noach, the children of Noach came around, that's when meat was permitted for mankind. There's different reasons why meat became permitted, why originally it was not permitted, why it became permitted at this time. For example, the Orach Chaim and the Ramban suggest that it was actually a reward for Noach, for looking after all the animals throughout that year of the deluge, that they were given now permission to be able to eat from the animals when they desired. The Malbim takes it, and not just so much that they had allowance to be able to eat meat because they tended towards the animals, but actually it became more necessary for the human condition. It was actually a weakening, he explains, after the flood. As we know, the lifespan of the antediluvians relative to those who lived afterwards was a lot longer, and therefore as the human condition weakened, it became necessary to have meat, and that's perhaps to help build the human condition, which again is probably subject to a whole scientific debate whether or not meat is actually perhaps healthy or good for you, but that was the approach that the Malbim went. Whereas other commentators such as Rasis Chachamim, again another commentator on Rashi, as well as Tzemach Tzedek, amongst others, bring that it wasn't so much necessary for humans, but actually became necessary for the animals. Because as we know, that not only obviously at the flood there was a corruption of mankind, but it also caused the corruption of the animal kingdom. Animals began to mate with each other and interbreed, and there was a lot of corruption also with the animals, and therefore to elevate the animals, the permission was given for Noach and his children to eat meat. As we'll explore as well, that's one of the ways that we can elevate the animals to be able to raise it to a higher spiritual level. Just to finish off Rashi says, Shneimar, as the Apostle says, Kol remes shel chai, all living creatures that crawl. It says, Kierek Esev will be like the grass of the field, like herbage. In other words, that which was originally permitted to Adam would now, like animals, would be also permitted to Noach. Originally permitted for Adam Rishon, Hashem says to Noach and his family, I've given to you everything as well. And in fact, this is the approach brought by the Talmud Yerushalmi. As you can see, the Talmud Yerushalmi brings in the end of Masechet Kedushim, Reb Chizkiah, Reb Chaim, Shem Rav, that Reb Chizkiah and Reb Chaim say in the name of Rav, Asid Adam in the future. A person will have to give to give what's called a judgment, a reckoning, an accounting. Anything that a person's eye has seen and not eaten. Again, the importance of the food that we are allowed to eat, that we have the ability to elevate it, and that which we did not eat or elevate will therefore be brought to an accounting. Why didn't you elevate? Why didn't you give this animal, as we say, the ability for it to be brought into a higher spiritual consciousness? This concept is also explained by the Kli Yakar, also by the Arizal and the Ramban, and also other commentators as well. There's a certain benefit to the animals to being elevated. And this is explained because the Kabbalists understand that there are 4 different levels within creation. And something known as Doimeim, Soimeach, Chai, and Medaber. That which was known as the mineral kingdom, there's the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, and then level of humans. And the concept is that each one draws sustenance from that which is lower, and by doing that is able to elevate it into a higher consciousness. You see it in the words of the Kli Yakar. He says, it says the commentators give a reason behind this. We have a principle that everything that is created is sustained from that which is below it. It says that which is inanimate is the lowest of all creations, the lowest of all that is found, and that gets sustained from itself. It doesn't actually require any other source for it to survive. Where that which is the vegetation and that which is the plant life is able to grow from that which is inanimate, such as water and soil, gets sustained from the land. And all things which are alive get sustained from that which grows. But mankind, which is known as the speaking creature, gets sustained from that which is the animal kingdom. And therefore, there's an idea of actually elevating the animals, as mentioned earlier, by the Tzemach Tzedek and the Tzivsei Chachamim. That's not to say, therefore, we can have what's called a callous or an insensitive attitude towards animals. In fact, the Talmud also mentions in Bava Metzia that we have to be very careful in our approach towards animals. In fact, there was a rabbi, a very famous rabbi, a Tana, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who was actually punished for his insensitivity that he had towards animals. The Gemara there brings a story about the Egla. There was a calf, some actually make a diuk, there was only a little baby calf, wasn't even a full-fledged animal, that was being brought to slaughtering. The Gemara says, that this animal went and it hid itself in the cloak of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and it was crying. And Amalei, and he said to this animal, Zil go, for that's why you were created, to be shechted. And it was with this sensitivity that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was punished with 13 years of scurvy and kidney stones, and this actually was only removed as a result of him showing compassion towards the weasels and mice in his house. And this is again this importance again of a balance. On the one hand, having the ability and perhaps the importance of eating meat, yet at the same time also showing extreme sensitivity towards animals as well. In fact, they say a story about an old man who witnessed Baal Shem Tov, and he saw a sheichet who was once rinsing his knife, his shchita knife. He was rinsing it under some water. He says he disapproved of the action. He says, I saw the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov for some period of time was a sheichet. And it says, I saw the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov used to wash his knife with tears. That was, it brought him to pain with the understanding that he was having to kill animals, even though he understood that sometimes, of course, it's a necessity, and there's even a benefit to animals as well. In fact, the Ramah brings in Shulchan Aruch that one does not make a shechianu blessing on derivatives or items of clothing that derive from animals, because how can we be saying thank you Hashem for bringing us to this time when at the same time that involved as a byproduct the destruction of a animal. In fact, the Talmud also brings in the Gemara in Bava Basra, it says Tanya was taught in the Brisa, Amir Yishmael ben Elisha says, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, from the time when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Dinhu, it's logical. That we should be decreed upon ourselves that we shouldn't really be eating meat and we shouldn't drink wine. Because how can we eat meat? How can we drink wine post the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, living after the Churban? We have no more sacrifices. We have no more wine libations. Rather, we have a principle The reason why this decree was not enacted because we did not make a decree that says that the community is able to stand unless the majority of the community is able to withstand by it. In other words, while it may be ideal from a Hashkafic perspective, especially living in exile, nonetheless it's also perhaps not realistic with the drive that often mankind has towards meat. A major proponent of vegetarianism was actually a rabbi called Avram Yitzchak Kook, who was actually one of the chief rabbis, the first chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, and he was of the opinion that to be a vegetarian is actually an ideal state. In fact, he personally very rarely ate meat. He only had it actually on Shabbos because he felt that while it was an ideal state, it was not something perhaps that we had brought into our consciousness at this level, perhaps be reserved for the Messianic redemption. In fact, he quoted a fascinating midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, which mentions in the future that only sacrifices will be of a vegetarian nature. There'll only be what's called menachos, meal offerings, although it does mention in other midrashic and Talmudic sources that in the future there'll be a feast for the righteous, which will be byproducts of certain animals. But I guess post that original feast, he was of the opinion that there will only be vegetarian sacrifices and there will perhaps be no longer a need to kill animals. In fact, he also mentioned that there's a concept that of kaparos, that kaparos as brought in the Talmud was originally not through the use of a rooster or a hen, but actually of a pot plant. And although, as mentioned, he did have a little bit of meat and chicken, because he felt we weren't actually at that level, he also had a hashkafic idea by saying that perhaps it's also appropriate to have a little bit of meat and to remember that, in that there is always a danger, there's always a concern that if we don't eat meat, perhaps the person might think we're on the same level as animals, just like we don't eat our fellow humans, we don't want to eat animals, maybe we're on the same level as animals. And perhaps just like animals aren't responsible for their actions, which is a whole separate discussion got to do with Bechira Chavshis, got to do with the idea of free choice. So too, perhaps humans are not responsible for their actions, and therefore may lead to a degeneration of society. And that's why he did encourage at some level that we should continue to eat meat at this stage in our lives. However, he saw it as a messianic ideal, just like in the beginning of creation where Adam did not have any meat. In fact, the Talmud brings, just to continue some of the sources, the Talmud mentions in the Gemara in Pesachim, Rebbe says, that while a person is allowed to eat meat, that should be reserved only perhaps for the Torah elite or for those that are going to elevate it. In fact, the Gemara says here that a simpleton or ignoramus should not eat flesh. And there's different reasons why. Some say it's got to do with the fact that they may not be careful when it comes to the shchita, when it comes to the kashrut or the kashrus of the animal, and when it comes to the specific slaughtering. Others say that no, it's because they're not going to elevate it. And the pasuk says, that this is the law of a domesticated animal and a bird when it comes to the slaughtering and it comes to sacrifices, to which the Talmud here makes a bit of a play on the words between the word Torah and animals to teach you that anyone who busies himself with Torah, only they, they're able to eat the flesh of an animal and a bird. Whereas but anyone who does not busy themselves with Torah, they're not allowed to eat the meat of an animal and a bird. And this is an idea, just like we know that birds and animals, obviously, I guess they're byproducts, at least for animals, are used when it comes to the construction of tefillin and Torahs. So to only those people who are involved in Torah and tefillin in holy aspects should really be allowed to have meat to be able to elevate the flesh that we consume. In fact, the Talmud brings that even when we do eat meat, it should be done in more of a reserved manner. The Gemara here, you can see here, brings the Gemara in Yoma, and Moshe says, when it comes to the man, we know that the Jewish people were satiated. When it came to their complaints for the man, they were given meat to be able to eat, and yet bread in the morning for satiation. So meat was given in the evening, not to be full on. In other words, one should be full on bread, but they can have an accompaniment of meat at nighttime. And from here, the Talmud learned down, the Torah teaches us a way of proper etiquette. A person should only have meat at nighttime. A person should not have meat except for when they are just eating a little bit before going to bed, not for satiation purposes. The biggest meal was breakfast, at least historically in those days, and in many countries today in the world. And this is the approach that one should have towards meat. In fact, the Rambam writes, to understand again from the realm of Halacha, that the sages commanded by ways of proper behavior, and that person should only eat meat when there is a desire to eat meat. Not there's actually an obligation to eat meat, but if a person wants to eat meat, so then it should only be done when there's actually a desire, a push to have flesh. And this is in fact obviously a bit of a balance. In fact, the Marshal, amongst other commentators, bring out that on the one hand there is an opinion that meat can potentially strengthen the body, at the same time also comes with a financial cost, and therefore it's obviously having a balance between those two ideas. And therefore the Rambam says one should only really be having it when there is a desire to have it. In other words, perhaps there's no obligation to have meat, but if you want to have meat, this is obviously a potential outlet that a person can have towards the approach of having flesh. Shneimah, the pasuk says, when literally your soul will desire to eat meat. That was, again, if you have a desire, you can eat meat, of course, if you want to. Although Bereishit, amongst others, saw it as a very carnal and lustful concept that the person is desiring to eat meat. In fact, the Rambam writes here, it's enough for a healthy individual just to have flesh, the Rav Kook did, from one Shabbos to the next. However, again, if a person can afford it, again, if he is wealthy, if he can afford to eat meat every single day, he can do that as well. Obviously, it's not going to impinge on one's financial success and one's financial ability, but otherwise one should obviously be more conservative when it comes to the eating of meat. Again, just to reinforce this Hashkafic idea, in fact, it's also connected in Parsha Bereishis to a sacrifice that was brought by Cain and Hevel. We know Cain and Hevel and the children of Adam brought sacrifices to Hashem, and the Torah goes out of its way to mention that Cain brought what's called from the vegetation, from flax, and Hevel brought from the firstborns of his flock, from the sheep. And the different commentators, of course, explain what the significance behind their sacrifices and why specifically they brought those sacrifices, etc., and what exactly was the dispute between Cain and Hevel. But one explanation brought is that Cain was somewhat of a vegetarian, and therefore he didn't want to kill an animal, even as a sacrifice, even to give towards Hashem. Whereas Hevel was, of course, okay with doing that because he brought obviously a sheep. And of course, there was a concern, as the commentators bring out, that if a person equates himself on the level of an animal, that was that you cannot kill an animal, just like you cannot kill a human, it can bring a person down to thinking once that perhaps I'm not responsible, just like animals kill animals, maybe humans can kill humans. And of course, that's of course what happens with Cain, that Cain goes later on as a result of Hashem not accepting his offering, his jealousy ends up him killing Hevel. And this is, of course, a major concern that the rabbis were worried about. If a person does not eat meat, he forgets to recognize where he stands, perhaps in the food chain, not just, I guess, in the food chain in a physical sense, but also from a ethical and moral perspective, where a person should be understanding that his obligation towards his fellow society and how he should behave should be on a more refined level. In fact, unfortunately, we saw this idea not just through the writings of Rav Kook, but also many years, or I guess really a few years after he passed away, with the Nazis. The Nazis, we know, were very careful when it came to biomedical experiments on animals because they felt it was animal cruelty, yet at the same time they were able to ruthlessly murder millions without any hint of concern. And again, this Hashkafic idea of why we're allowed to eat meat, again, it should come with that understanding that we are obviously on a higher level than the animals, and we have to act in a responsible manner. Just perhaps to conclude with a concept known as Likutei Amarim, which is a sefer known as the Alter Rebbe's Tanya. And he writes there in chapter 7, he says this concept that while obviously one should and one can, I guess, have meat, one also has to make sure that they use it, obviously, for a positive purpose. While there may not be an obligation to meat, in fact, if a person wants to convert, halachically they are allowed to convert if they are vegetarian. There's no obligation per se that one must eat meat, while there are times, as we know, that's encouraged to eat meat, perhaps on Shabbos and Yom Tov, that's with the assumption that the person enjoys eating meat, but if they don't enjoy it, that's also okay as well. And the most important thing is that it should be directed, l'shem shamayim, it should be directed to heaven. And this is brought to show inside the writings of the Alter Rebbe. He writes, going, for example, derech mashal, by way of analogy, the Torah, someone who eats the fatty meat of an ox, and also drinks wine that is spice, and is done laharchiv daita l'Hashem, in order to expand his mind towards Hashem and his Torah. Rav says, regarding wine and fragrances, have made his mind more receptive for Torah learning. So that, of course, is a positive idea. For example, to fulfill the mitzvah of known as taking delight in Shabbos and Yom Tov, that, of course, is a positive reason to be able to eat meat. And he goes on to explain that we're able to refine the life of the meat and the wine, which derives from something known as klipas noiga, which is literally called shells of life. It refers to something which has the ability to be elevated. He goes on to explain that which was technically mutar, that which is halachically permitted, is connected kabbalistically to the word matir, which means to untie, because the holiness or the sparks of kedusha that's found inside that which is permitted has the ability to be elevated. And that's, of course, should only be done if it's done in a positive purpose. This is, again, perhaps also a offshoot of the idea of the Ramban, perhaps another idea that we'll explore, known as Kaddish Atzmacha B'Mutalach, that we have to sanctify ourselves, that which is permitted. In other words, just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to do something, but if you are to do something, you should make sure it's done in a positive purpose. As he continues to try, because by doing this, you're actually elevating that like a burnt, elevating offering, like a sacrifice. However, he continues to write, someone who is a glutton of meat and a guzzler of wine, for example, to fill the desires of his body, and his animal soul, which comes from the foundation of water, from the four negative, shall we say, foundational primordial elements of the universe, that from it derives the attribute of desire. Actually draws down the life of the meat and the wine that's in his midst. Unfortunately, gets brought down, at least temporarily, until that's teshuva, in what's called the aspect of negativity, known as the three impure klipos. And this is again this concept that we have to elevate, of course, everything that we have. I just want to conclude by mentioning that they say you are what you eat. Of course, we have to be careful, not just what goes into our mouth, but also what comes out of our mouth. And we should merit to always elevate our food on a daily basis. With that, I want to wish you a good Shabbos, and thanks for watching.